This is the Puritan Pulpit. I'm your host, Nick Reddin, bringing timeless Puritan sermons from the past to inspire today's Christian. Welcome back to the Puritan Pulpit. I'm your host, Nick Reddin, and welcome to another Minicast. This one is titled The Puritans vs. Women Pastors. And this may be a little bit different because it is a little bit longer than the typical Minicast I do, but I think with this topic in particular, I wanted to be a little bit more thorough than I normally am, as I'm encouraging people to hopefully get enough information on the topics that I cover that maybe you'll go do your own research, your own reading, and really get more in depth with the knowledge of the Puritans and their stances on things. So today we're stepping to a debate that does feel modern, but it's actually rooted in the very bedrock of the 17th century world. We're looking at the Puritan position on women in the pastoral office. In our current culture, this is often dismissed as mere patriarchy or a cultural relic. But for the Puritan mind, it was something much deeper. It was a meticulously constructed theological system, a quest to harmonize the ontological equality of the human soul with the functional hierarchy of the visible church. And that's really important here. The Puritans believed the church should be an earthly reflection of a divinely ordered cosmos. To them, the restriction of the pulpit wasn't about lesser or greater value. It was about the creation mandate. Today, we're going to explore how men like Thomas Goodwin, Matthew Henry, and Jonathan Edwards argued that the law of nature and the creation ordinance established a pattern for gender and authority that the church is not at liberty to change. To understand the Puritan view, you have to understand lex naturae, the law of nature. They didn't see nature as separate from God's word. They saw it as God's first Bible, imprinted on the human conscience. The independent divine Thomas Goodwin argued that the silence of women in the public assembly was not just a suggestion, but a dictate of the first principles of nature. And that's from Goodwin's book, Constitution and Right Order of the Churches. The Puritans used Ramist logic to see the world in dual relationships, ruler and subject, master and servant, husband and wife. Matthew Henry, in his famous commentaries, took this a step further. He argued that public speech by women in the church was indecent because it ignored the natural distinctions God placed between the sexes. He wrote that shame is the mind's uneasy reflection on having done an indecent thing, and that's from his commentary on 1 Corinthians 14. For a woman to, quote, quit her rank and take the pulpit was in their eyes a violation of right reason. But let's be clear, this didn't mean women were silent in all spheres. William Gouge noted that while the public sphere was for men, women were joint governors of the home. They were the primary catechizers of the next generation. The hierarchy was about function and sphere, not spiritual worth, and that's something to remember. If the law of nature was the foundation, the creation mandate was the structure. The Puritans leaned heavily on the chronological priority found in Genesis. The Apostle Paul's argument in 1 Timothy 2:13, where it says, "For Adam was formed first, and Eve was their cornerstone." They didn't see this as Adam being better, but as Adam being the federal head. He was the legal representative of the race. Jonathan Edwards maintained that while the new honor of Eve was that the Redeemer would be of her seed, this redemptive promise did not abolish the structural subordination established at creation. As the Puritan tradition held, the covenant of grace, quote, redeems but does not alter the original creation ordinance. So think about that for a second. Even after the fall, the rule of the husband was seen as both a consequence and a divine remedy to prevent disorder. In the Puritan mind, you couldn't have a church that functioned in opposition to the way God built the world from in the beginning, right? But let's get to the plain sense of the text, as they like to say. The Puritans were above all people of the book. Two passages define their ecclesiology, 1 Timothy 2 and 1 Corinthians 14. In 1 Timothy 2:12, when Paul says, "I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man," the Puritans saw this as a new canon. Matthew Henry argued that teaching in the public assembly is an act of power because the pastor is called to be an overseer and a ruler. The role was viewed as fundamentally incompatible with the state of subjection assigned to women in the natural order, and that's from Henry's commentary on 1 Timothy 2. They distinguished between the gift and the office. A woman like Timothy's mother Eunice could be highly gifted, but the exercise of that gift was restricted to private and domestic context. To take the pulpit was a usurpation of headship. And what about 1 Corinthians 14? The command for silence was interpreted through the lens of decorum. The Abingdon Association of Baptists argued that managing the affairs of God's house required a single voice of authority. For women to ask their husbands at home was seen as the divinely appointed way of life, to pursue theology without violating the hierarchy of the visible church. Perhaps the most fascinating figure here is my personal favorite, Jonathan Edwards. During the Great Awakening, Edwards saw women having incredible spiritual experiences. His own wife, Sarah Edwards, was his spiritual paragon. He documented her ecstasies as evidence of a genuine work of God, as he would say. But here is the new light paradox. Edwards validated what he called the freshness of a woman's spiritual discoveries, yet he remained a strict traditionalist. Consider his letter to Deborah Hathaway. He encouraged her to be, quote, much in exhorting and counseling, unquote, even toward men. But if we look at the fine print, he told her to do it chiefly when you are alone with them. And then he explicitly cited 1 Timothy 2:12 as her boundary. Edwards was terrified of spiritual pride. He warned that when individuals, regardless of sex, abandoned modesty or reverence, they were opening the door for the devil. True religious affection for Edwards always led back to decency and order. Now we have to address the elephant in the room. Modern proponents of women in the ministry often point to biblical figures like Deborah the Judge, Huldah the Prophetess, or the daughters of Philip as precedents for female leadership. So you may wonder, how did the Puritans handle these so-called exceptions? They didn't ignore them. They categorized them under what they called the extraordinary call, the miraculous versus the ordinary. The conservative Puritan rebuttal was simple. God is above all law and may occasionally grant a direct divine afflatus to a woman to perform a specific task. However, they were adamant that these were exceptions that proved the rule. John Owen and Matthew Henry argued that while God could sovereignly use a Deborah to save Israel, the canon law of 1 Timothy 2 and 1 Corinthians 14 remained the binding standard for the ordinary state of the church. Just because God once made a donkey speak to Balaam doesn't mean donkeys are now commissioned to preach from the pulpit. I think we can all agree on that. The case of Deborah and Huldah, when modern arguments suggest these women held offices similar to pastor, the Puritans counter with 3 specific points. First one, civil versus ecclesiastical. Figures like Deborah held civil or prophetic roles, not the sacerdotal or pastoral office of the local church, which requires a specific ecclesiastical call. Second, Matthew Henry noted that God often raised up women as leaders as what he called shame or a judgment upon the men of that generation who were too weak or cowardly to lead. It was a sign of a disordered society, not a template for a healthy one. And third, Cotton Mather acknowledged that women could speak if they had an immediate impulse from the Spirit, but he insisted that the ordinary office of teaching, the systematic authoritative administration of word and sacrament, was committed to men only. Thinking through the cultural context argument, there is the modern claim that Paul's restrictions were merely a temporary fix for a specific problem in Ephesus or Corinth. Now, the Puritans preemptively answered this through their appeal to creation, because Paul grounds his argument in Adam and Eve, and you can see that in 1 Timothy 2:13. The Puritans argued the command is transcultural. If the restriction was based on a local Ephesian fashion, Paul would have cited the fashion. Instead, he cited Genesis. To the Puritan mind, arguing that these commands were merely cultural was a dangerous step toward antinomianism, the belief that the Spirit's new light allows us to ignore the grace of law established at the beginning of the world. But now we have to look even a little bit further here. We have to look at one of the most debated names in the New Testament, Junia. In Romans 16:7, Paul greets Andronicus and Junia, calling them outstanding among the apostles. Modern egalitarian scholars argue that this is the smoking gun, clear evidence of a female apostle in the early church. So, how did the Puritans and their successors deal with this? They approached it with a hermeneutic of order, using 2 primary rebuttals. First, for many Puritan-era scholars, the simplest explanation was that the name was masculine. John Gill, a successor to the Puritan tradition, argued that the name should be read as Junius, a contraction of the Roman male name Junius. He wrote, Junius should be read Junius. They rather seem both to be men. By identifying the person as a man, the conflict with Paul's other writings vanishes entirely. They believed it was more likely that a name was slightly misspelled or contracted than that Paul would suddenly reverse his creational theology. The other argument is known to verse 1 of. So, however, if Junia was a woman, as many early church fathers like Chrysostom believed, the Puritans had a second line of defense. They focused on the Greek grammar of the phrase outstanding among the apostles. Matthew Henry and John Owen argued that this did not mean she was an apostle, but that she was of note to the apostles. In other words, the 12 knew her well and held her in high regard because of her suffering and long-standing faith. Gill noted that they were well known by and in great account with the 12 apostles, though not of their number. So the Puritan conclusion on Junia to the Puritan mind in the apostolic office required three things: a direct call from Christ, being a witness to the resurrection, and the authority to govern the universal church. Since women were barred from the ordinary office of local elder by the law of nature, the Puritans found it logically impossible that God would appoint a woman to the extraordinary and higher office of apostle. Whether Junia was a man named Junius or a woman highly respected by the church leadership, the Puritan position remained unmoved. One obscure greeting in a list of salutations cannot overturn the plain sense of the creation mandate. Now, before we reach our final conclusion, we have to understand the high stakes of this debate in the 17th century. To the conservative Puritan, the pulpit wasn't just a piece of furniture. It was the axle upon which the entire wheel of society turned. During the chaos of the English Civil War in the 1640s, radical groups like the Quakers and ranchers began to cast off traditional gender roles, allowing what the Orthodox called she preachers to take the floor. Now, this wasn't seen as a minor denominational difference. It was viewed as a harbinger of total social collapse. The Presbyterian polemist Thomas Edwards, in his massive work Gangrenia, cataloged these disorders with genuine horror. He argued that when the canon law of gender is ignored in the church, the natural law soon fails in the home and the state. The Puritans often pointed to Isaiah 3:12, quote, "As for my people, children are their oppressors and women rule over them," unquote. And that was seen as a divine warning. For them, a woman in the pulpit was the ultimate symbol of a world turned upside down. They believed that if you remove the creation ordinances from the church, you lose the map for human flourishing everywhere else. This is why they fought so hard against figures like Anne Hutchinson. It wasn't about a personal grudge. It was about the conviction that the God of order protects his people through the boundaries he sets. They believe that true liberty isn't found in breaking the law of nature, but living harmoniously within it. And this brings me to my final thought. We have to ask, what is the legacy of this position? The conservative Puritan stance was not an act of chauvinism. It was a commitment to a vision of the church as a well-ordered world. They believed that every member flourished most when they adhered to the specific calling God assigned to them at creation. By distinguishing between the invisible church, where souls are genderless heirs of grace, and the visible church, where temporal order must be maintained, they sought to honor the spiritual equality of women without disrupting the creational headship they saw in Scripture. For the Puritans, the restriction of the pulpit was an act of perfect freedom found within the grace of law. They believe the God of order continues to govern his church through the timeless patterns established in the beginning. And I hope that we can agree that patterns God established in the beginning are ones that we can follow today. In not doing so, we end up with, I think, what we're seeing right now across the landscape of Christendom, and it's not great. And hopefully we can reclaim for the glory of God his standard. So thanks for joining me today. We'll see you next time as we continue to explore the riches of the Puritan tradition. I'm Nick Reddin, and this is the Puritan Pulpit. Thanks for joining me on the Puritan Pulpit. I'm Nick Reddin. Until next time, may these Puritan voices from the past continue to stir your faith today.